what I suppose is the ideal percentage as we look out in a field like this? What kind of percentage of plantain are we looking for with the naked eye, or what kind of seeding rates are we looking at to use in our mixtures?
Yeah, really good question, because I think it is about how much animals are able to consume in a day of this material. Typically, in the research that we've done, we are targeting 30% in terms of our animals' diet. So because this tends to be preferentially grazed, and we are grazing more of what's there, we tend to find that we could get 30% of the diet at maybe 20% of the in the sward. So it's those sort of levels that we're looking at. We don't get any extra benefit above 60%. So it's not like it's got to be wall to wall and the only thing in the diet. From a seeding rate point of view, it's really difficult to give absolute recipes in terms of what sowing rate will give you what content. That does very much depend, as we said earlier. If it's dry, a couple of kilos per hectare can look quite amazing. So it does depend on the local area. But if you were looking for having some ecotain in your swards, and you're looking for about you'd be looking for about 30%. Where you're into more of the herbal lays with a bit of ryegrass, then those sowing rates do have to be a whole lot higher. So I guess the question is, you've been putting some of these together. What sort of sowing rates have you been using?
Yeah, I suppose we use probably about 10% of the mixture, so that's 10% in a 12 kilo, 14 kilo bag. So we're in around 1.4, 1.5%, and so seed size is a thing to consider as well. It's a small seed, a little bit bigger than clover, so a little bit of seed goes a pretty long way with this stuff.
Yep, I think from a New Zealand setting, if we were putting it in very similar, I think that we wouldn't, as a mix, we would never go higher than 4 kilograms in a seeding mix per hectare. And in our full stands, I don't think there's any value probably in going over 10, but that's wall to wall plantain. So they're the areas, and you're right, it's a small seed, it goes a long way. In some of our situations, we do broadcast that, and that might only be at a kilo a hectare a year, and we're just topping up into an existing stand. So that's one of the other ways. If we are doing that, we tend to have to wait a significant amount of time to see the value in that. So it could be 12 months before we actually see real value in terms of that, and sometimes the establishment of that can be quite hit and miss, and sometimes we don't see anything at all. And so I think if we were employing that technology or that way of incorporating it, that we've just got to keep hammering away, and if we fail once, we've just got to keep going. And that would be the recommendation in terms of if we're going to use it. Much easier if we're dragging a drill or establishing it right at the start to get it into a farm system.
In terms of management in the rotational grazing system, obviously a similar system here to what you're used to. We are typically looking at getting into a paddock every 21 days, 3 weeks, depending on growth rates, things like that. And a question that we often get is, with the herbal lays, you have to extend your rotation. It's slightly out of sync with what I'm used to. Can you give us any practical tips on the best ways to manage a sward like this?
Yeah, if it's in with a ryegrass, I say it's the closest thing to ryegrass management. So I actually fear undergrazing more than I do overgrazing. So if we're in slightly earlier, that's probably of a benefit to the plantain plant in terms of its longevity within a sward. Where we delay grazing, we build up larger covers, particularly we let it throw a bit more seed head. They are the situations where we tend to over time lose that plant more quickly. And certainly the quality of that then starts to deteriorate pretty quickly. So my view really is in terms of rotation, we maintain our rotation. We shouldn't let this or give this an opportunity to throw more seed head than we need. My view around that is, that we get a lot of people saying, I want to let it seed to throw a bit more seed on the ground. The difficulty with that, instead of the 1 or 2 kilos that we've mentioned earlier, you might get 300. The plant is able to throw that amount of seed on the ground, equivalent to 300 kilos, and what you get is a mat of small plants that don't come to anything. So I think that if you think you're doing the right thing, you're probably not. Not only are you putting too much seed on the ground, but you're also giving the plant the opportunity to then say, I've done my job, and that plant will then disappear from the sward. So I think being kind to it is actually counterproductive. If it's in a good grazing round and we're grazing this relatively tight, then I think that's a good way of keeping it in the sward. In terms of the herbal lays, we notice that they're quite open. And one of the reasons that that's the case is that when animals go through and graze this plant, because it's quite different to a ryegrass plant, we eat most of what's there. And so if our utilisations are 80%, then there's not much left over, in those swards after grazing. And so I think that's a really important point in terms of, I still like tight grazing even in these lays. We don't need to be kind to it. I'd be more concerned about the chicory being grazed too often too tight. The plantain is the tighter and the slower the rotation, probably the better for that, all else being equal. The one other thing I will say is in terms of grazing in wet soils, that can be quite challenging because we do have this open ground. Plantain is in a plant that particularly likes being grazed in wet soils. The poaching damage can be quite detrimental to the plant numbers, but grazing the plant off at a relatively low level is not detrimental to it. It's probably the treading pressure that's going to be the most detrimental to that plant.
Yeah, I suppose in terms of the management, when we think about it, and we think about it a lot, I've thought about it a lot, it is very much similar to perennial ryegrass and it's plants in general. We want to be grazing them when they're leafy, and that's when they're at their best. So again, you're grazing your plantain when it's leafy, ideally. So regular and often is probably the best method.
Yeah, and I think we treat it like a ryegrass, and it's a very simple plant when you actually just treat it like a ryegrass.
We get asked a lot about different mixtures, and I suppose we use a 6-species mix here in Ireland predominantly. We get asked about heavy soils, wet soil or heavy soils, dry soil mixtures. But something that I see popping up on my timeline from Agricom a lot is these kind of, say, maybe plantain, red clover mixtures. Very much more simplified mixtures, but they seem to be really good for finishing animals. The potential quality here is something that I'd love to see on trial on some Irish farms.
Yeah, I think if you're looking at finishing animals and you can put two plants together like this, which you can use as very much a crop, then yes, there are some benefits in terms of finishing animals quickly. And if you come back to, again, those principles, here you've got two plants where you've got high protein available to the animal. They're easily grazed, so animals can eat large volumes of that relatively quickly. You've got these low rumen retention times. Again, animals are able to return to grazing sooner, so their intakes are higher. From a digestibility point of view, there's a lot of energy in those plants. And the thing I like about the red clover, for example, is it's bringing its own nitrogen. And so therefore you've got a system that's driving high performance with sometimes almost no nitrogen being applied from the bag. It's all coming from the ability of red clover to drive that. So I think those systems, particularly in the environments that we're in, where we are trying to reduce some of that fertiliser input, they can be very, very powerful.
Yeah, like I know forage brassicas are popular here, used through the summer and the winter. Maybe it could be a substitute for a low maintenance, low input option for that, and then you get the benefit of maybe it's a 2-year crop, repeated grazings across the year.
Yeah, you make a really good point around the brassicas because they have been used very extensively in terms of doing that particular job. But the red clover and the plantain swards do have some added value over that particular system, and that is that it does bring its own nitrogen. So being a legume, it's fixing nitrogen. Secondly, it's a very good regrowth crop, so you're getting multiple grazings off that. Relative to some of the brassicas, there's no stem involved, so the quality of that is very much higher. And I think the other really key thing is that because they're not perennial crops, these are 2 and 3 year crops. It means that the cost of having those they can be in for 2 or 3 years doing that finishing job. And the one thing I do like about this is we're in situations where you may have too much In a brassica system, you've got to eat that, you've got to do something with that. In a reclover stand, you can make silage out of that quite easily, and so it's quite flexible. And I like, as we move through some of these different environmental or the changing environment, being flexible I think is a really important aspect to some of these forages, and that's that brings a lot of flexibility to a farm system where you've got the use of a reclover and particularly Ecotain for that.
Thanks very much, Glenn. That was really interesting. I think we're only at the start of our plantain journey here in Ireland. There's a lot more to learn about it, first of all, and a lot more benefits, I think, that can come of it from its use for Irish farmers. So we're really excited to have access to Ecotain this year at DLF, and it's going to be included in all of our herbal lays. And if you want to try something a little bit different, it can be added to some of our grazing mixtures like 4N grazer or DLF grazer. If you'd like any more information on Ecotain, there's lots of information on our website, or you can contact any of the team for details.